The rain against the window pane of the Blackwood Hotel did not sound like water. It sounded like fingers, thousands of them, tapping a frantic, irregular rhythm against the glass, demanding to be let in. Elias Thorne stood in the center of room 612, his suitcase still gripping his hand, a heavy leather anchor keeping him tethered to a reality that already felt slippery and porous. He was a man accustomed to the sterile silence of modern architecture, to steel beams and glass facades that hid nothing. But the Blackwood was different. It was an organism of mahogany and velvet, smelling of dust and a century of exhaled breath. He had checked in late, driven off the highway by a migraine that fractured his vision into kaleidoscope shards of pain. And the concierge, a man with skin like parchment and eyes that seemed to look through Elias rather than at him, had handed him the heavy brass key with a hesitation that Elias only now, standing in the dim amber light of the room, began to process. "The fourth floor is under renovation," the old man had said, his voice a dry rasp. "And the fifth is full. You will be on the sixth, room 612. It is quiet there, usually." Elias had nodded, too blinded by the throbbing in his temples to ask what usually meant. But now, as the silence of the room pressed against his ears, the word echoed with a sinister weight. The room was standard for a hotel of this vintage, a four-poster bed that looked like a catafalque, heavy drapes that swallowed the light, and a wallpaper pattern of intertwining vines that seemed to writhe if you stared at them too long. Elias placed his suitcase on the luggage rack and walked to the wall adjacent to the bed. According to the brass plaque on his door, he was in 612. Logic dictated that to his left would be 610 and to his right 614. Hotels often skipped the number 13 due to archaic superstitions, a quaint nod to fear that Elias, a man of science and structure, usually found amusing. He placed his hands against the wall to his right. The plaster was cold, unnaturally so, as if the space on the other side was not a room but a freezer or a void where the heat of the world had been sucked away. He frowned, pressing his ear against the damp wallpaper. Silence. And then a sound so faint he thought it might be the blood rushing in his own ears, a soft, wet sound, like a sponge being dragged across a floor. He pulled back, shaking his head. The migraine. It was just the migraine. He stripped off his damp coat, the lining clinging to his skin, and moved to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. The mirror was old, the silvering flaking at the edges, creating black spots in his reflection that looked like holes in his face, voids where his eyes should be. He gripped the porcelain sink, staring at himself. "You need sleep," he told the hollow man in the glass. "Just sleep." But sleep was a predator Elias had been evading for months, ever since the accident, ever since the steering wheel had turned slick with blood and the clock on the dashboard had frozen at that damn time. He dried his face, the towel rough and smelling of starch, and walked back into the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. The red numbers burned in the semi-darkness, 02:44 a.m. He lay back, closing his eyes, letting the darkness take him. He woke not with a start, but with a slow, creeping dread, the kind that starts in the stomach and claws its way up the throat. The room was pitch black, the heavy curtains having completely sealed off the streetlights outside. The silence was absolute, heavy, like being buried under 6 feet of earth. Elias lay still, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't know what had woken him. He turned his head slowly toward the digital clock. 06:10 a.m. The numbers didn't blink. They stared, and then he heard it. It came from the wall to his right. The cold wall. The wall where room 614 should be. But the sound wasn't coming from a neighbor moving luggage or watching television. It was a voice. A woman's voice. It was muffled, thick, as if passing through layers of water and stone. "Please," she whispered. Elias sat up, the sheets pooling around his waist. The voice was so filled with desolation, with a hollow, rusted grief, that it made his teeth ache. "I didn't mean to," the voice continued, louder now, vibrating through the plaster. "I didn't look at the time." Elias swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet touching the carpet, which felt damp, sodden, as if the rain outside had seeped through the very foundation of the building. He walked to the wall, his breath hitching. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" The whispering stopped instantly. The silence that followed was aggressive, a held breath waiting to exhale. Elias pressed his ear to the wall again. He could hear breathing, not the rhythmic breathing of sleep, but the jagged, panicked gasps of someone hiding in a closet, trying not to be found. "I'm calling the front desk," Elias said, trying to sound authoritative, though he felt like a child in the dark. He backed away, reaching for the phone on the nightstand. He lifted the receiver. There was no dial tone. Instead, there was a low, static hum, and beneath the static, a rhythmic thudding. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a heartbeat, or perhaps footsteps walking down a long, infinite corridor. He slammed the receiver down. He looked at the clock. 06:12 a.m. The minute changed. 06:13 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was soft, polite, terrifyingly distinct. It didn't come from the hallway door. It came from the wall, the solid wall where no door existed. Elias froze, his blood turning to ice. He stared at the wallpaper. The pattern of the vines seemed to be shifting, twisting into shapes that looked like grasping hands and screaming faces. He backed away until his legs hit the bed. He wasn't crazy. He was tired, stressed, grieving, but he wasn't crazy. He grabbed his coat and threw it on over his shirt, jamming his feet into his shoes. He needed to get out. He needed to leave this room, check out, and drive until he found a Motel 6 with fluorescent lights and plastic furniture. He grabbed his suitcase and lunged for the door to the hallway. He tore it open and stumbled out into the corridor. The hallway was empty, stretching out in both directions, the carpet a long tongue of crimson runner. He turned to look at his own door. Room 612. He looked to the right. Room 614. There was no room 613. There was no space for it. The door frames of 612 and 614 were separated by only a foot of wall. Physics defied what he had heard. There was no room inside that wall. It was structurally impossible. Elias laughed, a brittle, jagged sound. "Pipes," he muttered, "just old pipes." He walked briskly toward the elevator, refusing to look back. He needed coffee. He needed to hear human voices. The lobby was deserted. The morning light was gray and weak, filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The concierge desk was empty. Elias rang the brass bell, the sharp ding echoing through the cavernous space. No one came. He waited for 10 minutes, the silence of the hotel growing heavier, pressing against his eardrums. He decided to leave his key on the desk and just go. He turned to the main entrance, the revolving glass door that led to freedom. He pushed against the glass. It didn't move. He pushed harder. Locked. He looked for a latch, a bolt, anything. There was nothing. The glass was seamless. Panic began to flutter in his chest, a tracked bird. "Hello?" he shouted. "Is anyone here?" His voice vanished into the high ceilings, absorbed by the velvet and the dust. He turned back to the lobby. The elevators were dead. The staircase, a grand sweeping spiral of marble, seemed to be the only way up or down. He didn't want to go up. He wanted out. He tried a side door near the restaurant, locked. He picked up a heavy bronze statue from a side table and smashed it against the window. The statue bounced off with a dull thud, leaving not even a scratch on the glass. The glass wasn't glass. It was something harder, something impenetrable. Elias sank to the floor, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was a nightmare. He had fallen asleep in the car or in the room, and this was a lucid nightmare. He pinched his arm hard. Pain bloomed, sharp and real. He was awake. He looked at his watch. 06:13 a.m. He frowned. That was impossible. He had been in the lobby for at least 20 minutes. He tapped the glass face of his watch. The second hand was twitching, vibrating in place, unable to move forward. He looked at the grandfather clock in the corner of the lobby. 06:13. Time had stopped, or rather, he had fallen out of time. A sound drifted down the marble staircase, a soft, wet, dragging sound. Elias looked up. The shadows at the top of the stairs were moving, coalescing into a shape. He couldn't make it out, but he felt a wave of malevolence roll down the stairs, a cold wind that smelled of ozone and rot. He couldn't stay here. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not up the stairs, but towards the service corridors behind the desk. He found a door marked staff only and burst through it, a narrow hallway lit by flickering fluorescent strips. He ran past linen carts and stacks of trays. He found a fire exit. He slammed his shoulder against the crash bar. It didn't budge. It was welded shut. He was trapped. The dragging sound was behind him now, louder. He ran deeper into the hotel, his mind fracturing. He needed to hide. He needed to think. He found a service elevator. The buttons were old black plastic. He hit the button for the basement. Nothing. He hit the button for the 6th floor. The doors rattled and slid open. He didn't want to go back there, but the sound of the dragging was getting closer, accompanied now by a low, guttural weeping. He stepped in and the doors closed just as a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the hallway. The elevator groaned, ascending slowly. Elias huddled in the corner, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Why was this happening? What had he done? The memory of the accident flashed in his mind. The rain, the slick road, the other car swerving, the woman's face in the other windshield, her mouth open in a scream that was cut short by the impact. The clock on the dashboard. 6:13 p.m. The elevator dinged. 6th floor. The doors opened. The hallway was different. The red carpet was gone, replaced by a floor of charred wood. The wallpaper was peeling in great strips, revealing walls that looked like raw meat, pulsing and wet. The air was hot, suffocatingly dry. Elias stepped out, coughing. The numbers on the doors were melted, illegible, but he knew where he was. He walked down the corridor, drawn by a pull he couldn't resist. He reached the spot where room 612 should be. The door was gone. In its place was a blank wall. He looked to the right. Where the solid wall had been, where the impossible space between rooms had existed, there was now a door. It was made of dark ancient wood, heavy and scarred. There was no handle, only a brass plate screwed into the center. It didn't have a number. It had a time. 6:13. Elias stared at it. The door seemed to hum, a vibration that rattled his teeth. This was the source. This was the cancer at the heart of the hotel. He reached out to touch the wood. It was warm, like living skin. "Open," he whispered. The door didn't move, but from the other side, he heard the voice again, the woman. "It's time," she said. "It's always time." Elias felt a surge of anger, hot and blinding, overriding his fear. "Let me out," he screamed, pounding on the wood. "Let me out of this place." The doors swung open silently. There was no room inside. There was only a scene, frozen in amber light, suspended in a void of darkness. It was a hospital room. Elias stopped, his breath caught in his throat. He knew this room. He recognized the sterile green tiles, the smell of antiseptic and stale flowers. In the center of the room was a bed and in the bed lay a man. His face was bandaged, tubes snaking from his arms and throat. The monitor beside the bed beeped a slow, failing rhythm. Sitting beside the bed was a woman. Her back was to Elias. She was weeping, her shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Elias." Elias took a step forward into the room that shouldn't exist. "Elena?" he whispered. The woman froze. She turned slowly. Her face was pale, ravaged by grief, but whole. It was his wife. But she wasn't dead. She had survived the accident. He was the one in the bed. He was the one broken and dying. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, crumbling his reality into dust. He wasn't checking into a hotel. He wasn't running from guilt. He was in a coma. He was dying. And this place, this hotel, was the waiting room, the answer room to whatever came next. "No," Elias whispered, backing away. "I'm awake. I'm real." The woman in the chair, Elena, didn't see him. She looked through him at the broken body in the bed. "They said it's time to let go," she sobbed. "They said there's no brain activity. It's been 6 months, Elias. I have to let you go." The scene in the room began to dissolve, the walls melting into black sludge. Elias stumbled back into the hallway of the hotel. The charred floor was gone. The red carpet was back. The hallway was normal, but the door to 613 remained. It was closing. "Wait!" Elias screamed. He didn't want to die. He wasn't ready. He lunged for the door, but it clicked shut with a sound of finality. He was alone in the corridor. The silence was absolute. He looked at his watch. The hands were spinning wildly now, a blur of motion. He looked at the door of room 613. He could hear movement inside. Someone was walking around. Someone was settling in. He realized then that he wasn't the visitor. He wasn't the guest. The hotel hadn't trapped him, it had processed him. The memory of the hospital, of Elena, faded like a dream upon waking, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the hallway. He felt a weight in his hand. He looked down. He was holding a chisel. He didn't know where it came from. He looked at the door of 613. The wood was pristine, dark and inviting. He felt a compulsion, an instruction written into his very code. He was part of the architecture now. He was part of the mechanism. He walked to the door. He knelt down. The wood carved easily, curling away in soft ribbons. He worked with a singular focus, his mind empty of fear, empty of hope, filled only with the purpose of the room. He wasn't Elias Thorne anymore. Elias Thorne had died in a hospital bed at 6:13 a.m. He was something else. He was the warning. He finished his work and stood up. He admired the letters carved into the dark wood, jagged and raw. "Your turn next." He felt the vibration in the floor. Footsteps. Someone was coming. A new guest. A man named Arthur, or David, or John. It didn't matter. They were all the same. They all carried guilt like luggage. They all needed a place to sleep. Elias, or the thing that had been Elias, stepped back. He didn't need to hide. He wasn't visible anymore. He was the draft in the hallway. He was the creak in the floorboards. He was the shadow in the corner of the eye. He watched as the elevator doors opened down the hall. A man stepped out, looking tired, holding a suitcase. The man looked at the key in his hand, then at the numbers on the wall. He walked towards room 612. He paused as he passed the blank section of the wall, the space where room 613 would be if the world made sense. The man shivered, pulling his coat tighter. He unlocked room 612 and went inside. The hallway was quiet. Elias waited. He watched the digital clock on the wall, visible only to him. Time was looping, resetting. The numbers clicked. 6:10 a.m., 6:11 a.m., 6:12 a.m. Elias moved to the wall. He raised his hand, now cold and translucent. He prepared to knock. He knew the script. He knew the role. The clock ticked. 6:13. He knocked 3 times, softly. Knock, knock, knock. He heard the gasp from inside the room. He heard the footsteps approaching the door. The man inside opened the door to the hallway, looking left and right, seeing nothing. But Elias wasn't at the hallway door. He was in the wall. He was in the time between seconds. The man went back inside, confused, terrified. Elias waited for him to look at the wall, to hear the message, to understand that the checkout time is non-negotiable. The hotel stretches infinitely, a labyrinth of guilt and purgatory, and every room is full, but there is always space for one more in the time that doesn't exist. Elias pressed his face against the barrier between the dimensions, his mouth opening in a silent scream that would manifest as a low hum in the pipes of room 612. He was the keeper of the time. He was the resident of the minute that kills. And as the man in 612 began to weep, realizing he was trapped, Elias felt a flicker of satisfaction. He wasn't alone. He would never be alone again. The cycle would continue. The knock would always come. The message would always be read. And the time would always be 6:13.